did you have last night for dinner? Was it a meaty burger or was it perhaps an Indian lentil dal? Why did you choose your dinner? Food and our habits around food are shaped by our traditions, our families, our environments, and they are part as well of a political discussion because our food consumption is related to CO2 emissions. Because of the tight relationship between food production and CO2 emissions, the Ministry of Food, Agriculture and Fisheries of Denmark has provided an action plan for plant-based foods in an attempt to facilitate more plant-based eating. However, Denmark traditionally has a pretty meat-heavy cuisine. So making a switch might not be as easy for people. In today's conversation, I spoke to Amanda Krog Juvik, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Food and Resource Economics at the University of Copenhagen. She's part of the research project Crisis Culture Food, Eating Up the Crisis, Cultural Change Seen Through the Lens of Food, and she examines how climate change, but as well as inflation, shaped the food culture in Denmark. Our conversation touched upon traditional Danish culture. We as well spoke about the big picture, about political tensions between rural communities and urban elites. Turns out a lot of people are aware that climate change is a problem, but it's not easy to implement change in everyday life. This conversation was very interesting to me because it is touching upon something incredibly personal and almost intimate. It's your own personal food behavior, which you learn from your parents and your environment. And this very personal experience is part of a political debate. So I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. My name is Alice, I'm your host, and now let's get into it. Welcome, Amanda. I'm very glad that you took some time to speak about the Danish food culture. And when I was researching this topic, I always had to go back to my own memory and experience of studying 1 year at Roskilde University. And one of the highlights of the days was the big, luscious buffet of salads at the cafeteria. Roskilde University has, of course, a cafeteria, and it's like the centerpiece was a very, very big salad buffet. And I got the impression that it was very beloved by a lot of students who came from Copenhagen and commuted in the morning. And my impression, that's over a decade ago now, was that Denmark is already pretty much forward moving when it comes to plant-based options, and it's very acceptable. But I might be wrong. So tell me a little bit about the Danish food tradition and the food culture.
I think traditionally the Danish food culture has been rooted in sort of self-sufficiency and also seasonality. So people have relied a lot on what's grown, obviously, in the Danish climate, and also a lot of things about preserving elements, so pickling or fermenting. And we also have, I would say, the foods that are the main sort of traditional food items in the Danish food culture has been elements such as potatoes, root vegetables, cabbage, rye, pork, dairy products, and also fish, in particular fermented like herring. So we have a really big sort of pork farming industry. We're one of the world's largest exporters of pork, so pig meat. And we also have a really big sort of strong dairy culture as well. The whole sort of agricultural cooperatives in Denmark is really big. So we have that also both really big in our own food culture, a lot of dairy products, but we're also a big exporter of that. And then obviously, I think since the mid-century, with the industrialization, urbanization, and globalization, we obviously have the introduction of a lot more processed foods and also convenience meals, but also sort of more global ingredients as different sort of spices, so curry, cinnamon, all sorts of stuff. So obviously we have the traditional Danish dishes that such as containing pork, potatoes, gravy, roast pork, rye bread, which we have these sort of open-faced sandwiches, meatballs, we have lever pate, and they still sort of remain cultural symbols in the Danish diet. A lot of Danes still eat these dishes, but we also have obviously the introduction of a lot more global food like Italian food, Thai food, Mexican food, and so French food and so forth has also been introduced in the Danish food culture. And I would say it's very burgers, pizzas, and all that is also very dominant in the food that Danes eat on a daily basis. So the sort of traditional dishes that are very pork heavy is, I would say, something that we eat a lot, and like Christmas or other sort of events, cultural events. It is also still dominant in a lot of the Danish homes. We're very meat heavy, essentially, actually, even though, as you said, the salad bar at the university was great and there was a lot of salad. I would say Danes definitely also eat salad, but we are pretty heavy on the meat still.
Yeah, I mean, we're approaching Christmas time as we're recording now, so I can imagine that this is going to increase over the next weeks of indulgence. I really appreciate the fact that you already said from the get-go that is a cultural symbol for many people. Yet at the moment, maybe you can explain it a little bit to the listeners. There is a national plan to promote plant-based eating because, as you outlined, it's a very diverse food culture that you have in Denmark, but still traditionally on pork, like very reliant on food products. What is currently happening with this idea to promote more plant-based foods, and what are drivers behind it?
So Denmark, obviously, along with the rest of the world, are facing and have faced and will face many major crises. And obviously in recent years with climate change, this has affected our environment, our health, our food supply. We're also seeing other big crises that also affect these elements. So, and when we sort of look at where global emissions are coming from, animal agriculture is one of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's also one of the sort of key drivers of elements such as soil degradation or loss of biodiversity in these different elements. And if we look at the IPCC and their sort of numbers, the global food system accounts for approximately 30% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously how we produce and consume our food is a very big contributor to climate change and a big driver of climate change. And then at the same time, as our population is also growing on a global scale, so that also obviously means that food demand is bigger than ever. And I think this demand becomes even more visible in times of crises. And we've already seen with the example with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, how that sort of disrupted global food supply chain, and it really caused food prices to spike sort of record high, and that has also led to an economic inflation. And even though that inflation has dropped again, food prices in Denmark, and I think also we see it in a lot of other countries, have really never really returned to pre-crisis or pre-inflation levels. So all of these different challenges, so the environmental, the economic, also health challenges as well, have led the Danish government to want to strengthen the plant-based sector in Denmark. And it's also part of this sort of broader green transition of the agricultural industry. And they've launched this action plan for plant-based food in 2023, which frames plant-based foods not sort of only as a way to reduce emissions, but also as an industrial export opportunity as well. And they're trying to sort of position Denmark as a front runner in this global market for sort of green and plant-based options.
You are researching in this project crisis culture food, which is very much on point, what it's particularly about, and the entire change about particular habits and perhaps of remodeling what tradition means to people. I imagine this to be quite challenging. Explain a little bit how you are viewing this intersection from food to cultural change.
Obviously, this is a very sort of complex issue, and there's a lot of challenges in terms of how we go about understanding why people eat what they eat and how we go about understanding change. So also, how do we change people's dietary habits and routines, which is something that we grow up with learning culturally, right? It's depending on how we where we grow up, what family we grow up in, what country we grow up in. All these different elements sort of obviously create the habits and the routines and the way that we go about eating. And if you look at sort of in the Danish population, as I've already also touched a little bit on, climate-friendly foods are actually not very normal amongst the Danish population currently. And when we look at sort of statistics, I would say I think it's approximately half of the Danish population or even more agree that we need to reduce our meat consumption and our dairy consumption. But still, this ambition is really not turning into action. It still remains very difficult. And while we see that there's sort of a trend towards reducing the consumption of beef, and the consumption of chicken, which then has a sort of lower carbon footprint, has then increased, which I guess you could say is in a sense good, and beef has decreased. Overall, there's still not really any clear signs that Danes are shifting towards more plant-based foods and less sort of meat consumption, dairy consumption, even though people sort of express a concern for the climate. And obviously there is many, I would say, cultural explanations for why this is so difficult despite people's good intentions and Danes' good intentions. So a lot of people want to change, but they're not doing it. And as mentioned, traditional diets in Denmark are very sort of meat heavy and also dairy heavy due to our agricultural industries. So the way that people grow up learning how to create a meal is very organized around meat. That is sort of the main ingredient, right? And then you create the side dishes or everything around that. So people grow up and are taught to cook with meat as the sort of main center of ingredient. And we learn that sort of the proper meal is something that consists of meat, and that is the good source of proteins, whereas culturally, legumes and more plant-based options are not something that is sort of ingrained into the platter or sort of the Danish food culture and the Danish cuisine altogether. And also to sort of understand these very sort of ingrained habits and routines that we have as humans and why they're so difficult to change is also trying to understand how if we look at sort of our food practices, so the way that we cook food, the way that we eat food, the way that we go about shopping foods, these activities are something that we do in a very sort of routinized and a very habitual manner, and we don't really give it much reflective thought throughout our everyday lives. So you might imagine you're standing in the supermarket and you're had a really long day. You might have picked up kids if you have kids, or you're coming home from a fitness class, you've had work and you're tired, and then you're standing in that supermarket and you're deciding what to eat. And here, even though you might have aspired to sort of green values, we are habitually inclined to opt for what we know and what we already have learned culturally. So when we're tired and stressed, we're probably going to opt for that, spaghetti bolognese or meat lasagna that we've already cooked many times because that's what we were exposed to and that's what we grew up with. And we're going to choose that without really giving it much reflective thought to us. So sort of the attention that we dedicate to our daily meals obviously have to be balanced with all these other obligations that we have in our daily lives. So work, school, cleaning, leisure activities, kids, and so forth. So in sort of reality, our habits and daily routines sort of become a very strong obstacle to changing our diets. And again, people are not used to cooking plant-based foods, so they don't feel very competent to prepare tasty plant-based meals. And in that sense, often what we see is that sort of plant-based meals often come to be seen as sort of a compromise on taste. That's how people feel about it often when they cook it, because they don't have the competences to cook it. They've never learned it. They've always learned to cook around meat. And people also want to sort of adapt their food consumption to the social circles that they are in. So we all want to fit in, right? So here, even though you might be inclined to changing some of your eating habits, going about that in a circle or in a workplace where everyone is very meat heavy, you don't want to feel like a burden. That's also going to make it harder for you to change your diet to something that's more plant-based.
Yeah, I can relate to this mental protocol, especially in points of exhaustion. Like when you said you're tired after a long day of work and you have obligations and perhaps the day continues at home. The mental capacity might not be there in certain times of exhaustion as well. I fully see, as I mentioned, we're heading towards the Christmas period. And as well in Germany, I know in other places, you're going to start eating meat. When you gather with friends, with family, there's going to be a meat centerpiece somewhere. And you don't want to be the rude one who lectures people. So I do see it as a very complex and understandable pattern. But given the climate crisis and as well the willingness of people to do something about this, what do you see is a potential driver of change? Like, is there actually a driver of change? It almost feels like we're so stuck in our ways that change seems very unattainable.
Yeah, there definitely is ways to go about changing the way that we do things. It can be a bit of a tedious and slow process, but there's ways to go about it. When we look at sort of the majority of current food policy and also a lot of research, it sort of typically places a strong emphasis on the individual consumer's responsibility to change their practices or their diets or whatever sort of way we are consuming. And it's often done through sort of education or awareness incentives in that sense. So teaching people about how they can do things differently. And at this point, people know about climate change, right? They know that we need to eat less meat. That's also what we hear when we are out talking to people. It is something that people are aware of, right? And even though, and the people that already sort of have those green values as well and aspire towards eating more plant-based, a lot of them still don't sort of translate those values into sort of actual habits and practices. We call this sort of the value action gap in research, which means that just because you have green values, it doesn't necessarily translate into actual behavior and action. So in reality, people don't really know how to transfer the knowledge and awareness for plant-based options into practical solutions in their everyday lives. So creating more awareness in the shape of knowledge and food literacy about plant-based options isn't really going to solve the problem. And that's mainly where a lot of food policy is situated right now, is to create awareness and knowledge. And that really isn't going to solve the problem alone, because again, first of all, people know about it, the value action gap. They're not really going to change their practices just because they know about it, or even because they have those green values. And this sort of just constantly creating more awareness and education also, again, puts a lot of responsibility on the individual consumer to change their consumption. But it takes for granted, or it forgets, that if the adequate, sustainable alternatives are not available to us in our environment and accessible to us in our environment, we're not going to change, right? So what we also really need to enable people to change is institutional change, physical, material change, to sort of foster that food culture transition. So if we are to understand how to go about change in a more sort of, I guess I'm a sociologist, so a sociological approach is, again, if we go back to what I said earlier, Danes right now, from what we know from research, is that climate-friendly foods are not very normal in the Danish population, and I think in a lot of other populations as well.
Mm.
So what we need is to normalize plant-based foods. And we know from studies that the more people encounter climate-friendly and plant-based foods in their everyday life, the more these sort of diets and ways to eat plant-based is going to be more normalized and become normalized for them, because the more they're sort of exposed to them, it's going to be easier for them to also adopt and change their eating habits. So a way to go about sort of normalizing climate-friendly and sort of plant-based meals, so in a way that enables people to encounter it more frequently in their daily lives, could be through changing sort of their material environment, the institutional environment, in a way that it promotes more plant-based foods. So that could be, say, if you in your work cafeteria, if they create plant-based meals, that's a way that you get exposed to it. Because again, most people don't want to go out of their way. If they have a food cafeteria, they're not going to go out of their way and go and buy lunch in some other store. It's just easier. Everyone goes down to the work cafeteria. If the only option there is plant-based foods, they're going to most likely choose it, right? And they're also going to sit with colleagues and they're going to talk about, in a social setting, about what they're eating. Okay, this actually tastes pretty good. So they're exposed to the plant-based food as well. It helps to normalize the plant-based meals in people's everyday lives. They're seeing, oh, you can actually cook a nice plant-based meal. I can get full from a nice plant-based meal. It doesn't have to contain meat for these sort of things. And that they might translate that as well to what they go home and
So basically,
well.
what you mean by institutional and material change is you get exposure or exposure in the vicinity, so that you have this convenience character. But I can imagine that's as well very difficult to go about. I mean, people, if they don't feel like eating that, you probably first have to convince them, and then there might be some backlash on that. So probably it's a difficult task, and I wonder who would be in charge and who would be willing to take this task, because there's so much push against nanny state, and the state shouldn't intervene with people's preferences and tastes. And at the same time, companies, they want to sell something which is popular, and they don't want to start investing into something like food which are not going to be purchased. Mm-hmm. So it is quite a conundrum.
Yeah, it definitely is. It is, I think when we're out in our research project talking to people about how they feel about changing their habits, and also how do they feel about the government imposing dietary change on them, a lot of people really feel that this is an individual matter, and that the government definitely shouldn't impose how they eat and shouldn't decide what they eat and do not eat. But I think there's ways, again, to go about creating that sort of change more institutionally or through public institutions. Again, if we are exposed to these things in situations, again, because our everyday life is so routinized and so habitual, and we don't really think a lot about what we actually do. We just do it because we've done it so many times. If we take the cafeteria example again, most people are not going to go out of their way and go to another place and buy food. They're going to go and they're going to eat that plant-based option that is available to them in the cafeteria. They might mock about it with some of their colleagues, but over time, they're still going to eat it. And that sort of process where they're being slowly more and more exposed to these plant-based options can have sort of a ripple effect translate into them thinking, okay, this is actually not that bad. And in that sense, it will slowly become more normalized in their sort of way of understanding what good food is. How can we eat nice food? What is a proper meal? Those elements can change. And we are already seeing in a lot of cafeterias in Denmark, for example, that maybe they have one day where they have just a plant-based food. Some cafeterias might only do plant-based food. So all of these different elements, and it's also a part of the Danish a plant-based action plan is also to sort of try and promote and really sort of incentivize some of these public cafeterias to cook more plant-based meals to help sort of that process of normalization. And then obviously also in the supermarket, we also need to see supermarkets have more plant-based options accessible and available to people. And we're also seeing, instead of having maybe a just plant-based section where all the plant-based meat alternatives are, place them together with the meat, the actual meat, right? So when you're standing there, okay, there's all these different meat options. I need to make spaghetti bolognese. Oh, okay, I can actually see there's also this plant-based option right when I'm looking, because I know where to go. I always go to the same place when I go to the supermarket to make it, again, easier, faster. I might try this today, right? So normalizing these things also really require this change in sort of institutionally and materially.
I'm interested in understanding the differences between demographic groups, because I assume that it's probably not all types of citizens are going to have the same approach and the same attitudes about this question. In your research, do you see typical demographic groups where you would say those are the front runners, and perhaps as well those are people who are opposing strongly against it, or is it kind of like a mixed bag?
In the project Crisis Culture Food, just a sort of disclaimer that the project started last year, and the purpose of the project is that it's a longitudinal project. We've established a panel of 60 Danes across all of Denmark, so there's a variation in gender, in regions, in city size, in socioeconomics, so how much people earn, their educational background, these different elements. And the point is to go and talk with these people, so every few years, to sort of look and understand how is their food habits changing or not changing in relation to what's going on in society on a more macro level. So in relation to climate change or the inflation, how is that sort of affecting their food and their opinions about how this development is going and so forth. And because the project just started a year ago, we only have one round of interviews right now. And we're still in the midst of analysis. So I think everything I say is sort of preliminary. So it's just a little disclaimer for that. But I can give some sort of thoughts on what I think we're seeing in this first round of interviews of some of the sort of tendencies that we're seeing. And I think overall we're seeing that there is, again, a general awareness that we need to eat less meat to tackle climate change. And many of our participants are also expecting that we are, as a society, a Danish society, will be eating less meat in the future. We ask people about, what do you think our diets are going to look like in 15 years' time? And a lot of them are imagining that we are going to be eating less meat. They just don't really know how we get there, or they might be opposing of it, but they see it as something that's happening in the future. And we obviously see a bit of, I think, a generational divide. So for younger people, are often more open and inclined to eating plant-based options. They also often express more environmental concern compared to some of the older generations, where sort of meat and more traditional Danish dishes still holds a very strong cultural position. We also see a gender divide. So, and this is also in general research about this, and to see that women are often more inclined and more positive towards changing their dietary habits compared to men, because meat is oftenly very sort of strongly tied to ideas of masculinity, protein gains, and like fitness and these sort of elements. So, and then we're also seeing a more sort of rural and urban divide, which also has sort of a class dimension. We see that people from sort of a higher educational background, urban lifestyles, are generally more embracing of plant-based foods, whereas Danes that are living in more rural areas often sort of articulate a sense of a very strong connection to Denmark's agricultural history and also sort of our present day food production. So where meat obviously takes up a big center place. And so we're seeing this sort of rural-urban divide, which I find quite interesting. And it also has this class dimension as well to it.
Touch upon the topic of agricultural tradition, agricultural jobs, and everything that's connected to it. Because in developed nations, the agricultural sector usually doesn't add a lot of jobs nowadays. It's a very, very small part of the GDP in most developed nations, as well in Denmark. And technically, if you wanted to shift agricultural production to plant-based alternatives, there would be perhaps a market for it. There would be an opportunity to develop new jobs. But is this even part of the conversation, or are people not seeing this as a viable alternative to what is present?
I would say that it's not a part of the conversation, really. I don't think that the general Dane sees that there is this potential in the plant-based sector as something that can really sort of create jobs and exports and that whole element. So it's not something that I think people necessarily are aware of, and even maybe if they are aware of, there's still that very sort of strong sense of identity tied to the traditional Danish agriculture, which consists of pork and beef and dairy. So, and I think also, obviously, you have people that are farmers, that have had farmers in their industry. They grow up surrounded by farm fields, and it's something that's very present in their way of understanding Denmark and the Danish identity. And I think it's hard for them to imagine that these jobs could potentially still continue, but they could look a bit different, right? And be more focused on creating plant-based. So it's not really something that we see.
Yeah, but you said that people are very much aware of inflation and the changing prices of food. Do you already have any insight to how the development in food prices has changed consumption patterns?
Yes, we're seeing a change in terms of, again, beef consumption has gone down a little bit because that is very pricey at the minute, and also certain types of dairy products or olive oil, and these elements are gone really, really pricey. So that is affecting some groups in society, especially people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are impacted by the inflation or the food prices. But I would say people from sort of higher socioeconomic backgrounds, they are obviously seeing that prices are high and they're annoyed by it and so forth, but they're not affected by it in the same sense, I would say. And what we also see is that even though people might consume less beef, which obviously has a really high CO2 footprint, so in that sense, it kind of has a counter climate effect that people are reducing their meat consumption or beef consumption, but we're not seeing that people are changing it to buying legumes, which are low in CO2. Instead, people might buy more chicken instead. So they're still centering their food around meat, but they're just maybe changing what that meat is.
I think it's a very interesting moment in time when we talk about this topic, especially because a couple of weeks ago, the EU was having this discussion in the parliament about the labeling of plant-based alternatives, that they should not be named like veggie sausage or something like that. I personally think this is the wrong approach. I think most people are intelligent enough to understand that a veggie burger is not meat and veggies. I think the people usually understand such concepts, but there's a lot of like conversation about backlashes and what is the perspective, and what are your next steps in your particular research project? Because there seems to be a momentum right now of tension. So where do you want to look in the near future?
Yes, yeah. Just to add on what was agreed upon in the EU, I definitely agree with you that we see from studies that people are aware that there's a difference between plant-based sausage and a meat-based sausage, and people do not just stand down in the supermarket and come home and be like, oh, I didn't know it was plant-based that I bought, right? So it is really unfortunate that is the way that they've chosen, because it really will otherwise I would say, calling things names that people already know. So it's a burger, it's a sausage. It is only going to help normalize again, enabling people to eat more plant-based. So it's unfortunate that they've removed that. And I think something that I find really interesting in our project, and it's something I'm going to dive more into in the near future, is that what we're seeing is that there is sort of sustainability discourse sort of becomes entangled in a bigger sort of us versus them dynamic, especially between urban and rural Denmark. We're seeing there's a disagreement about whether we should go about changing our habits and changing to more plant-based. And we see that people living in sort of more rural areas, who also often tend to be lower social economic groups, they tend to have sort of very, again, strong emotional and cultural connection to the agricultural heritage of Denmark and the food production today, where meat obviously plays a central role, both practically but also symbolically. For them, it seems like that this sort of overall sustainability agenda feels very imposed from above. They feel like politicians, urban elites, they don't understand their way of life. They don't understand rural life. They don't understand their economic realities as well. This group of people might not be able to afford the right green products, organic produce, buy the right electric vehicles. So they don't tap into having that sort of right green taste. What we see is actually a bit of sort of anger and also resentment, which are not just directed at plant-based foods themselves, but also sort of what these foods represent. We see how people feel like they're being moralized, right? And this regulation is moralizing them. Urban elites are telling them what's the right way to go about living. You guys are doing it wrong. Why are you continuing to eat meat and having these jobs in the farming industry? I think what's interesting about this is that even though obviously the sustainability discourse that's, coming from the city, the politicians and so forth, can actually reproduce social boundaries, and it can reproduce social inequalities, and it can shape resentment and anger towards the climate agenda. So especially because the sustainability discourse reflect the values and the lifestyles of people that are privileged, the urban groups, who are, interestingly enough, those who have the high carbon footprint, right? Compared to often the more rural, lower socioeconomic groups who actually have the lower carbon footprint, but they're not a part of this sustainability discourse, and they feel angry at it, right? And we're really seeing that with some of the people we're out talking to. They feel alienated, they feel powerless, they feel it's condescending. I think it's quite interesting also to go about thinking, how can we promote change? We really need to think about how these discourses around sustainability can backfire, right? If they don't resonate with people's lived experiences, their socioeconomic experiences, and if it becomes a cultural marker of the educated urban middle classes, it sort of risks just deepening divides and sort of create this backfire to the whole sustainability agenda overall.
That's super important what you're explaining, and I see there are definitely some valid points. Some plant-based alternatives are more expensive. Like when you look at the typical vegan sausage, it is pricier than the meat alternative. So the class dimension here is something that probably a lot of people are kind of understanding as a concept, but not how much it viscerally affects people and how much it actually means to them. Do you see any, perhaps, like, it's very early in your project, but do you perhaps see any hints of lending a helping hand, so to say, or building a bridge, or creating any form of conversation between people where it's not about culture clash, where it's not about condescending, but perhaps as something that is a mutual project within a cohesive society to progress to a future which is more sustainable? Are there any hints?
I feel like at the moment, I think it's more going sometimes the opposite direction, unfortunately. Obviously, I will say that when I'm talking about that we're seeing some resentment and anger, I will still say that this is minority. So it is a smaller group. It is not the majority. The majority of Danes uh, are seeing that we need to change and that we need to do something. And some people feel guilt, or some people feel like, oh, I just don't know how to go about it, or these sort of elements. So overall, we are seeing that people, the majority of people, do want to do something about it. They just often just don't know how to sort of go about it, or they negotiate their sort of personal responsibility in this, and obviously the tension between other demands that they have in their everyday life and sort of ideas about what is the good life and how that clashes with a more sort of sustainable way of life. So overall, I would say we are seeing a positive development, that things are moving, but we are also seeing that the sort of backlash is also growing a little bit. And I think obviously that ties to a lot of other things that are happening in Europe, in the world, right? We're seeing certain agendas being pushed, and also growing sort of right-wing populist agendas are growing, and that often this sort of backlash to the sustainability agenda ties sort of into some of that populist and also more right-wing narrative as well. And unfortunately, I think we can say that that is also a growing agenda. So I'm not sure how that merge or coalition is going to happen, but I definitely think that recognizing that this agenda is creating inequalities, and it doesn't take into account people's real economic lived realities in rural or lower socioeconomic groups. If we don't take into that account, if we don't recognize these things, we're not going to get these people on board, right? I think we need to stop judging others, and also sometimes look at ourselves, right? As someone living in an urban area with a high education, it's easy for us to point fingers at some farmer. Why do you keep having this farm industry, and why do you eat so much meat? But really, my climate footprint is bigger than theirs, right? I fly all the time or whatever, so I might not eat meat, but I have other elements that puts me on a high carbon footprint. So I think recognizing these inequalities is quite important.
I'm curious to see in a couple of years what the results are going to be of the project, and if there are perhaps some key takeaways that other countries can learn from. But as of now, do you have any specific advice or any hint towards for people who want to start educating themselves about the topic, how to start, where to start? What would you say?
Right. Well, I think it's just a simple like Google search away, honestly, to Google, how do I go about changing my everyday life, or how do I go about eating more plant-based? Where can I find recipes that look really nice in social media, with food that looks nice and not difficult to make? I think those sort of elements. I think if people want to like locally try and do something to push for a more green agenda, or even like when it comes to food, if you have a workplace cafeteria, try and see if you can push that to maybe one day a week where there's only a plant-based option, maybe 2 days a week, or at least if there's no plant-based option, get that plant-based option. I think those are some of the things that can really help on a local level to sort of promote more plant-based eating, and help again normalize that plant-based foods compared to the sort of meat heavy elements.
Amanda, thank you so much for the conversation. I thought it was super interesting, and I wish you all the luck with your research project. And hopefully you're going to find whatever you're searching for, and you're going to present some interesting results in a couple of years. So thank you very much, and take care.
Thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk. It's been really good and interesting.
Thank you for listening to this episode of European Glimpse. This is a passion project of mine, and it would make me very happy if you subscribed or shared this episode with a friend. Now I'm curious to find a new guest. Are you a journalist, a scholar, a student, or perhaps an avid observer of society? If you live in a European country, as well outside of the European Union, reach out to me or recommend somebody I should speak to. I would as well love to hear your feedback on this podcast, as I'm always trying to improve, and my email is europeanglimpse@gmail.com. Take care.